The rain fell in sheets that morning, turning the gravel drive to mud as Elizabeth stepped down from the military issue car. Her boots sank slightly, and she tugged her coat tighter around her, more against the chill of fear than the cold. Ahead, the sprawling manor of Bletchley Park loomed, its brick walls and tall windows betraying nothing of the world-changing secrets inside. She had been summoned with little explanation, just a terse note: "Your skills are needed. You will report immediately. What you do here is vital and must never be spoken of." Elizabeth's heart raced. At 22, she had spent her life buried in books, solving mathematical puzzles for fun, never imagining that one day her talent could be weaponized against a war machine as terrifying as Nazi Germany. She paused at the gate, taking in the manicured gardens, the long avenues lined with trees, and the hum of distant voices. Something told her she was crossing into a world unlike any she had known, one where the fate of millions might rest on the sharpness of her mind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the tang of oil from the machines whirring in the distance. Women in uniform, their faces pale from long nights and endless calculations, glanced up from their desks, exchanging brief nods before returning to the complex patterns of letters and numbers scrawled across sheets. No one spoke of the outside world. The news from London seemed distant, muted. Every message cracked here, every enigma code broken, could mean the difference between survival and annihilation, but nobody outside these walls would ever know. Not her parents, not her friends, not even her fiancé, who waited in the safety of a small town miles away. A stern woman in her 30s approached, her eyes sharp as a hawk. "You're late," she said, though there was no trace of anger, only the weight of urgency. "Time isn't ours. Not here, not ever. They think they're sending secrets in a simple jumble of letters. But those letters hide the plans to sink our ships, bomb our cities, destroy the very lives of our people. You and the others, we're the only ones who can stop it." Elizabeth swallowed hard, the enormity of it settling like a stone in her stomach. She had expected a job, maybe even adventure. She had not expected to be handed the invisible threads of a secret war. One fought not on the beaches or in the skies, but in silence. Behind locked doors and beneath the relentless tick of clocks, she followed the woman through corridors lined with doors, each labeled with codes rather than names. The walls seemed to whisper of hidden dangers, of victories that would never be celebrated, of sacrifices no one would acknowledge. Somewhere in the maze of offices, machines clanked, wheels turned, and minds raced against time, translating chaos into intelligence. Each keystroke, each cipher solved, might tip the balance of a world teetering on the brink. Elizabeth paused before her assigned desk, a simple wooden table under a narrow window that let in the gray light of an overcast sky. She took a deep breath. Outside, the war raged with bombs, bullets, and blood. Inside, the quiet of Bletchley Park held a different kind of battle, one fought with wits and courage, with the kind of bravery that never made headlines. And she, one small, untested mind among hundreds, was about to dive headfirst into it, unaware that what she would accomplish here could save thousands of lives, yet must remain a secret forever. The door clicked shut behind her, and Elizabeth sat down. The hum of the machines and the rustle of papers filled the silence. The real war was just beginning. Elizabeth had barely settled at her desk before the reality of Bletchley Park began to sink in. The hum of machines and the shuffle of papers were accompanied by a quiet intensity she had never experienced in her life. Every face she passed seemed etched with focus. Yet behind each pair of eyes was a story, a talent, a skill that had gone unnoticed or dismissed until now. Women arrived at Bletchley for reasons as varied as their handwriting. Some were mathematicians, trained to see patterns in chaos. Others were linguists, gifted in the cadence and structure of languages that could unravel the most intricate codes. Still others were simply brilliant, though conventional schooling had failed to recognize it. Elizabeth remembered one young recruit, a woman named Margaret, who had spent her adolescence solving problems in the margins of textbooks because no one took her seriously. Margaret's hands trembled as she wrote out a sequence of letters on a page, but her mind raced faster than the gears of the machines around her. Here, her abilities were not only valued, they were essential. Joan Clark, a name whispered with both admiration and awe, became a legend almost overnight within these walls. She had been overlooked by the world, dismissed as simply clever enough but not extraordinary. Yet at Bletchley, Joan's talent for mathematics and her uncanny ability to see connections invisible to others placed her at the center of the operation to crack the Enigma machine. Even the most seasoned men in the room deferred to her insights, their respect grudging but genuine. She was one of the first women to be entrusted with the most sensitive tasks, and her story became a quiet inspiration for the younger recruits who arrived, like Elizabeth. Unsure of the role they could play in this invisible war, the recruitment process had always been secretive. Letters arrived in plain envelopes, bearing cryptic instructions or names of contacts. No one was told the full purpose of the assignment, and curiosity was often met with an abrupt, "You will understand in time." Many of the women had been scouted from universities, colleges, or even through puzzle competitions, places where intellect could shine even in the shadow of gender expectations. For some, it was the first time the world had truly recognized their abilities. For others, it was the first time they had been trusted with life or death responsibility. Elizabeth remembered the moment she was introduced to the room that would become her battleground. It was not a battlefield of mud and blood, but one of paper, cipher, and the relentless pursuit of patterns. The tension was palpable. Every keystroke could lead to a breakthrough or a dead end. Every calculation mattered. The knowledge that Nazi forces were communicating in codes that could direct submarines, bomb cities, or obliterate entire convoys weighed on every shoulder. The women worked quietly, their successes invisible to the outside world, yet infinitely more consequential than most soldiers on the front lines. Despite the pressure, there were moments that revealed the humanity behind the intellect. A young recruit named Ruth, shy and soft-spoken, had an extraordinary gift for languages. She could hear the difference between subtle dialects, nuances that would have escaped a native speaker. Yet Ruth had spent years being told she was too timid to matter. At Bletchley, she became indispensable, her small voice deciphering the subtleties that would otherwise be lost. There were bursts of laughter during breaks, whispered encouragements when a solution was found, and quiet sighs of disappointment when progress stalled. Life outside these walls, letters from home, newspapers, the chatter of the streets seemed a distant, trivial echo. The contrast between their ordinary lives and the high-stakes work they were performing could not have been more stark. Elizabeth thought of her parents, who believed she was merely working in intelligence, unaware that their daughter was part of a team that might change the course of the war. She thought of friends who had written letters, encouraging her in mundane pursuits while the fate of nations hung in balance. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a thrill tempered by fear. Each recruit had to learn quickly. Failure was not an option, and the outside world would never know if they succeeded. Even the mundane details of life at Bletchley carried weight. A misplaced sheet of paper, a careless conversation could be disastrous. The women became hyper-aware, attuned to every sound and gesture. Yet, within this pressure cooker, they found camaraderie and purpose. Friendships formed over shared triumphs and collective exhaustion. Mutual respect was forged in the crucible of secret, vital work. Elizabeth began to realize that intelligence alone was not enough. Courage, resilience, and trust in one another were equally essential. The story of these women was one of hidden brilliance. They were pioneers in a war no one outside the walls could see, their talents finally recognized in a place that valued them for what they could do, not for the expectations society had placed upon them. Elizabeth understood, even as she began her first calculations and analyses, that she was not just solving puzzles, she was part of a hidden army, a force that could tilt the scales in a global conflict. And yet, the world would never know their names, their faces, or the battles they fought in silence. As she stared at the jumble of letters and numbers before her, Elizabeth felt a mixture of awe and fear. She was no longer a student or a dreamer, she was a codebreaker, part of something far bigger than herself. And the hidden war had only just begun. The morning light barely reached the high windows of Bletchley Park when Elizabeth arrived at her desk, clutching a notebook and a pencil that already felt inadequate for the work ahead. The manor had transformed into a hive of relentless activity, each room filled with women hunched over sheets of paper or clattering machines. The constant rhythm of keystrokes and typewriters creating a mechanical heartbeat that echoed through the corridors. Hours stretched into days with scarcely a pause. There were no breaks for meals unless stolen in fleeting moments, no time to dwell on the cold or the hunger gnawing at the edges of focus. Every message intercepted from German communications carried the weight of the world. A single mistake, a miscalculated rotor setting, a misread cipher could allow a U-boat to strike a convoy or a bomber to reach its target. The stakes were invisible, yet omnipresent. Pressing on every mind like an unseen hand, Elizabeth learned quickly that talent alone was not enough. Speed, precision, and intuition were equally critical. She watched as her colleagues, women like Joan Clark, Margaret, and Ruth navigated complex formulas with the calm of practiced minds, their fingers flying across pages and machines in ways that made Elizabeth both awed and terrified. The machines themselves were temperamental. The bomb could jam or misfire, erasing hours of progress in a moment. One day, a critical message about a naval convoy disappeared when a wheel locked unexpectedly, and the room held its breath, waiting for a miracle that finally came after tense minutes of frantic recalibration. Yet, within the pressure cooker, there were small sparks of humanity. Laughter often erupted quietly over a shared joke, a clever misstep, or a friend's momentary panic. One afternoon, Elizabeth recalled Margaret nearly toppling a stack of paper, only to be saved by Ruth's lightning-fast reflexes. A chorus of stifled giggles followed, before the seriousness of their work swept them back into silence. Camaraderie became a lifeline, a reminder that they were not alone in the invisible war. Every glance, every shared sigh, every whispered encouragement forged bonds stronger than any family ties. The emotional toll was relentless. Elizabeth felt herself on the edge of exhaustion most days, her mind churning through endless patterns and substitutions. She began to notice subtle changes in herself and others, eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, fingers stained with ink from frantic calculations, hands shaking after hours of deciphering. Some women clutched letters from home, reading them with trembling hands, the outside world a fragile memory in contrast to the high-stakes reality surrounding them. The knowledge that their work was essential to saving lives pressed down like a weight, and yet no one could talk about it, not even among themselves. Small moments of suspense punctuated the long hours. A decrypt that almost revealed a German submarine route could vanish under a misread signal. A sudden crash from a machine could send everyone scrambling, hearts racing with the fear that a breakthrough had been lost. Rumors whispered through the corridors. Some messages were never decrypted in time, leading to convoys being sunk or bombings going unaverted. Each near miss reinforced the urgency, each success a fleeting triumph that had to remain hidden from the world. Elizabeth began to notice patterns not just in codes, but in the rhythm of life behind the walls. Mornings were predictable, a blur of calculations and machine checks. Middays brought tension as messages arrived in bursts, each carrying unseen consequences. Evenings were the hardest. Fatigue layered over anxiety, and yet no one could leave until the work was done. A subtle hierarchy had formed, not of rank but of expertise, and the women respected it fiercely. Joan Clark's guidance became invaluable. Margaret's insight a constant support, Ruth's language skills an unexpected weapon. Each played a critical role, and Elizabeth's own abilities began to find a rhythm, her confidence building amidst the chaos. Despite the intensity, moments of reflection still found their way in. Elizabeth sometimes gazed out of the tall windows at the gardens, the rain glistening on leaves, and thought of the war raging beyond these walls. Families waiting for letters, towns bombed in silence, ships sinking in the North Sea, all of it threaded through the work they did here, unseen and unacknowledged. They were soldiers of a different kind, fighting with intellect and precision, carrying the burden of secrets that could never be shared. By the end of the day, Elizabeth's muscles ached, her eyes burned. and her mind whirred with numbers and letters long after she left the desk. Yet there was a strange exhilaration, a sense of purpose that made the exhaustion almost bearable. She understood now that Bletchley Park was a world apart, a place where ordinary women had become extraordinary, and every decision, every calculation, every small success mattered more than anyone outside these walls could imagine. As she closed her notebook and glanced at the darkening sky, Elizabeth felt the tension coiling tighter within her. Tomorrow would bring more messages, more codes, more pressure, and perhaps, just perhaps, a breakthrough that could shift the tide of the war. She knew only one thing for certain: behind these walls, the real fight had only just begun. The room was electric with quiet intensity. Every desk was a universe of charts, papers, and machines, yet all eyes were fixed on the problem that had confounded the Allies for months: the Enigma machine. Its rotors, ever-changing, scrambled German messages into what seemed like an endless jumble of letters. The men at Bletchley had attempted solutions, theories, and endless permutations, yet time after time the codes refused to yield. And now, in the center of this storm of calculation, women like Elizabeth, Joan Clark, Margaret, and Ruth were poised to make history. Elizabeth stared at the paper in front of her, the letters swimming after hours of painstaking analysis. She had become accustomed to the rhythm of Bletchley, the hum of the bomb, the scratch of pencils, the muttered calculations that might hold the key to victory. But today felt different. The tension was palpable, an unspoken knowledge that the messages arriving from the front lines could decide the fate of thousands of lives within hours. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a convoy of ships carrying soldiers, food, and ammunition was sailing through waters filled with hidden dangers. A single decrypted message could mean the difference between life and death. Joan Clark, already a legend in her own right, leaned over Elizabeth's shoulder. Her eyes scanned the sequences with an intensity that made Elizabeth's chest tighten. "Look for the pattern here," Joan whispered, pointing to a string of letters that seemed random at first glance. "The Germans change the rotors daily, but there's always a subtle flaw, a repeated motif. We just need to find it." Elizabeth nodded, her pencil flying across the page, marking connections and possibilities. Every second was precious. Each attempt to decode felt like a small battle against an invisible enemy. The bomb, a machine of clanking wheels and intricate mechanics, churned tirelessly in the background, running through permutations at speeds far beyond human capacity, yet dependent entirely on the correct inputs provided by these women. Their brilliance was not in brute force but in insight, the ability to see what the machine could not, to anticipate patterns that even the Germans might not have realized existed. Hours passed in a tense blur. The women's minds worked in perfect harmony, a silent orchestra of intellect and intuition. Margaret cross-checked a series of rotor settings. Ruth listened for linguistic irregularities in the intercepted messages, and Joan coordinated their efforts, ensuring that no detail went unnoticed. Elizabeth's hand ached from writing, her eyes burned from staring at endless sequences, yet she barely noticed. Every failure was a lesson, every partial success a spark of hope. Then it happened. A sequence of letters fell into place, almost imperceptibly at first. Elizabeth's heart skipped as she traced the connections, the jumble of symbols beginning to reveal a hidden structure. She looked up at Joan, whose eyes reflected the same mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. "This could be it," Joan said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Margaret fed the new rotor settings into the bomb. The machine groaned and clicked, wheels spinning in a frantic dance. Time slowed. Every eye in the room followed the blinking lights, the rising tension mounting with each passing second. Then, a chime rang out, a signal that the machine had found a match. A decrypted message emerged on the printout. Clear and precise, Elizabeth read the words aloud, her voice trembling. U-boat positions coordinates for an attack on the Atlantic convoy. Estimated time of strike, 0300 hours. The room erupted into a controlled chaos of excitement and disbelief. They had done it. They had cracked the enigma for this critical message, and lives would be saved as a result. The teamwork, the brilliance, the sleepless nights, all of it had led to this moment, but even amidst the triumph, There was no time for celebration. Every decrypted message demanded immediate action. Officers were alerted, plans adjusted, and ships rerouted. Somewhere far away, soldiers who would never know the names of the women who saved them were given a fighting chance. The enormity of it sank in. These women, hidden behind walls and secrecy, had altered the course of a battle and perhaps the war itself without anyone ever knowing. Elizabeth's hands shook as she returned to the desk, already scanning the next sequence of letters. The adrenaline was still high, yet the weight of responsibility pressed down. Every success carried the knowledge that failure was always possible, that the Germans could and would change their codes, forcing the women to start again, faster, smarter, sharper. The pace was relentless, yet within this intensity there was pride, camaraderie, and a deep understanding of purpose. Joan approached Elizabeth quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is why we're here," she said softly. "Not for recognition, not for glory, for the people who will never know we exist, for the lives that depend on us every single day." Elizabeth nodded, the words sinking deep. Here, in the quiet intensity of Bletchley Park, women had become warriors, not with rifles or bombs, but with intellect, intuition, and courage. The success of cracking this particular Enigma message sent ripples throughout the park. Teams coordinated to check their own sequences, verify their findings, and prepare for the next wave of intercepted messages. Every breakthrough was a small victory in an endless battle, yet each one carried the weight of lives, strategy, and the unseen hand of fate. Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come as a young, uncertain recruit, untested and unaware of her potential. Now, in the midst of history, she had witnessed firsthand the power of intellect and collaboration. The women of Bletchley were not just solving codes. They were altering the course of events, shaping the very outcome of the war in ways that no headline would ever reveal. As the night fell and the lamps flickered over the desks, Elizabeth paused to look at her colleagues. Faces lined with fatigue, yet eyes shining with determination, reflected the same realization: they were part of something greater than themselves. The hum of the bomb, the rustle of papers, the rapid calculations, they were all part of a secret symphony. A war fought in shadows with minds as sharp as any blade, and though the world would never know their names, Elizabeth understood that this moment, breaking the enigma, saving lives, defying impossibility, would be remembered in the echoes of history, in the hidden victories of a war that raged both outside and within the walls of Bletchley Park. The clatter of machines had faded, replaced by a quiet that carried both relief and exhaustion. The urgent thrill of cracking the latest Enigma message had passed, leaving in its wake a strange emptiness. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, feeling the ache of hours spent hunched over pages of letters and numbers. Outside the windows, the sun slanted weakly through the overcast sky, illuminating the orderly gardens of Bletchley Park. A stark contrast to the chaos of the war. For all their achievements, recognition was scarce. The world outside carried on as if these women didn't exist. Their contributions remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. Families assumed they were performing clerical work, or perhaps analyzing intelligence in ways too mundane to be notable. Even Elizabeth's parents, proud of her intellect but unaware of the true weight of her work, wrote letters congratulating her on her important duties for the war effort, never realizing that their daughter had saved lives she would never hear about. The burden of silence weighed heavily on many. Pride and frustration coexisted in every quiet glance exchanged between colleagues. Margaret, who had often struggled to have her talents recognized before Bletchley, sometimes shook her head in disbelief at the irony. "We risk our minds, our health, our entire lives," she murmured one evening over tea, "and no one outside these walls will ever know. It's maddening." Ruth, sitting across from her, offered a soft smile. "It's not for recognition," she said. "It's for the people who will live because of what we do." Yet even that sentiment, noble as it was, couldn't erase the occasional sting of invisibility. The longing for a world that might see and value their sacrifices. Friendships formed quickly in this high-pressure environment, forged in the crucible of shared purpose. Elizabeth found herself confiding in Joan, whose calm brilliance had guided so many through seemingly impossible decrypts. They spoke quietly in the corners of the rooms, discussing sequences and rotor settings, but also their lives outside, hopes, fears, and the strange sense of being part of a world that didn't and couldn't acknowledge them. Laughter occasionally broke through the tension, a fragile rebellion against the weight of secrecy. Rivalries, too, simmered beneath the surface. Some women felt frustration when ideas were dismissed or overlooked, especially in a world still largely dominated by men. Yet even these tensions carried a strange sort of respect. Every disagreement, every challenge, pushed each woman to sharpen her skills, to see patterns more clearly, and to anticipate mistakes before they could occur. Elizabeth realized that the friction itself was part of the system, part of what made Bletchley Park so effective. Life outside the park offered little relief. Letters from home, brief weekends in town, or stolen moments in the gardens brought fleeting normalcy. Yet Elizabeth always returned to the workbench with a lingering anxiety. The war didn't wait, and neither could she. Every decrypted message was a lifeline, every mistake a potential tragedy. And still, the world outside remained oblivious to the unseen battles waged within these walls. Despite the lack of recognition, personal growth blossomed in unexpected ways. The women became fearless in their intellect, resilient in their spirit, and steadfast in their moral courage. Elizabeth found confidence she had never known, the kind that comes not from applause but from knowing she was capable of extraordinary things when the world demanded it. Joan's quiet determination inspired her, Margaret's persistence reassured her, and Ruth's uncanny perception reminded her that every contribution, however small, mattered immensely. Even small victories became monumental in significance. A successful decryption, a message rerouted in time, or the prevention of a U-boat attack provided validation that could not be measured in accolades. Each woman knew the stakes, and each bore the knowledge that their brilliance, though invisible, was pivotal. The camaraderie of their shared struggle formed bonds stronger than any recognition from the outside world could offer. They were a secret army, invisible yet indispensable. Elizabeth sometimes thought about the future, imagining a world where women like her would be remembered, where the brilliance, courage, and sacrifice of these codebreakers would be acknowledged. But in 1942, the recognition was years away, buried under layers of secrecy. Still, she understood that heroism didn't always need a stage. True heroism, she realized, existed in quiet brilliance and tireless dedication, and in the courage to fight a war without applause. As the days rolled on, Elizabeth and her colleagues continued their work, their lives intertwined with numbers, letters, and machines. They laughed, argued, celebrated small successes, and consoled each other in failures. And always the knowledge lingered. What they accomplished here would never be seen by the world, but it would shape it irrevocably. The hidden heroes of Bletchley Park carried their secret with grace, pride, and an unspoken camaraderie. Their work was dangerous, exhausting, and unacknowledged, yet it was vital. And though the world would not know their names for decades, Elizabeth understood something profoundly important. Impact was not measured by recognition, but by lives saved, by battles altered, by history quietly rewritten in the shadows. As she left her desk that evening, Elizabeth looked out across the darkened gardens, a cool wind brushing her face. She felt the weight of secrecy settle comfortably on her shoulders. The world might never know their story, she thought, but in the quiet triumphs and invisible victories, the women of Bletchley Park had already changed everything. Decades passed, and the world outside Bletchley Park moved on, unaware of the invisible army that had quietly shaped history. Elizabeth, now older and reflective, often thought back to those days with a mixture of pride and a lingering ache, the weight of secrecy that had shadowed every triumph. For years the women of Bletchley lived with the knowledge that their work, though decisive, would remain unspoken. Some retired quietly, some pursued ordinary lives, and some carried the burden of silence like an invisible medal. Unseen but heavy, it wasn't until the late 20th century that the first cracks in this long-standing veil began to appear. Documents were declassified, memoirs were published, and journalists started piecing together the story of Bletchley Park. Slowly, the world learned that the names of ordinary women, Joan Clark, Margaret, Ruth, Elizabeth, and countless others, had been attached to extraordinary feats of intellect, courage, and persistence. Their work had shortened the war, saved countless lives, and altered the course of history. Yet for decades they had been hidden in plain sight. Elizabeth watched with quiet awe as the recognition unfolded. Biographies and historical accounts began to honor the contributions of the female codebreakers. Joan Clark's story, once confined to whispers in the corridors of Bletchley, was celebrated in books and films. Awards and honorary acknowledgments arrived posthumously for some, while others received medals and ceremonies that felt simultaneously surreal and long overdue. Historians emphasize that the women's brilliance had not been merely supportive, it had been pivotal. Each calculation, every pattern recognized, every cipher cracked had rippled through time, influencing events the world would never fully see. Surviving codebreakers reflected on their experiences with a mix of humility and pride. Elizabeth, when invited to speak at a gathering of historians, struggled to articulate the decades of hidden toil. "We were just doing our job," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "We didn't think about recognition. We thought about saving lives, one message at a time. We didn't fight with guns or bombs, but in our own way we fought. And in that fight we were together, unseen but determined." Her words resonated with others in the room, many of whom had only read fragments of Bletchley's history and were now beginning to grasp the enormity of the contributions made by these women. Media portrayals further brought their stories to life. Documentaries captured the intensity of the work, the hum of the machines, the meticulous calculations, and the brilliant minds behind them. Films dramatized the tension, showing audiences the invisible battles fought with intellect, courage, and unrelenting focus. These portrayals highlighted not just the technical genius of the women, but also the emotional weight they carried, the fatigue, the pressure, and the quiet heroism that had never been publicly acknowledged. Yet even with this newfound recognition, there remained a profound sense of reflection. Many of the women had lived their lives knowing that the world would not celebrate their triumphs, that their names would be absent from textbooks, history lessons, and public memory. Elizabeth often thought about the younger recruits, like she had been, who had walked through Bletchley's gates with nothing but their minds and courage. The acknowledgement, while deeply meaningful, could never fully repay the years of invisible service. The nights spent calculating under pressure, or the constant tension of knowing the fate of thousands rested on their shoulders. Interviews with historians and experts painted a broader picture of their legacy. They emphasized that the contributions of the women of Bletchley Park were not anomalies. They were proof that brilliance transcended gender, that intellect could change the course of events when applied with courage and focus. Their stories became case studies in resilience, collaboration, and the quiet power of determination. Schools, universities, and research programs began referencing their achievements, inspiring new generations to pursue mathematics, logic, and cryptography, especially among young women, who saw in these pioneers a reflection of their own potential. Elizabeth sometimes visited Bletchley Park itself, now preserved as a historic site where visitors walked the corridors she once knew intimately. She would pause at the desks where she and her colleagues had worked, running her fingers over the surfaces as if trying to touch the ghosts of the past. Plaques commemorated the contributions of all the codebreakers, men and women alike. Yet the women's recognition carried a particular resonance and acknowledgement of decades-long silence finally broken. A celebration of brilliance that had been hidden for too long. Despite the accolades, the essence of Bletchley Park remained unchanged in her memory. The quiet urgency, the hum of machines, the shared determination, the camaraderie forged under immense pressure, these were the things that defined the women's legacy. Recognition could honor their achievements, but the true power of their work lay in its impact, invisible though it had been for so many years. Elizabeth knew that in every victory at sea, every convoy rerouted, and every life saved, their efforts lived on. She often reflected on the lessons of those years. Bravery was not always loud. Heroism did not always require a battlefield. Impact did not always demand recognition. In the quiet corridors of Bletchley Park, in the ceaseless rhythm of calculations and decryptions, ordinary women had accomplished extraordinary things. Their legacy was not just in the historical record, but in the inspiration they offered to generations who would follow, proving that intellect, courage, and determination could shape the world in ways both visible and unseen. As Elizabeth walked through the museum halls, she lingered at the exhibits that recounted the women's stories. Faces stared back at her from photographs, names etched in plaques, testimonies recorded in books and films. She felt a profound sense of connection, not only to those who had fought alongside her decades ago, but also to the millions whose lives had been touched, often unknowingly, by their work. In that moment, she realized that recognition, while long delayed, had arrived in the form that mattered most: understanding, remembrance, and an enduring legacy that could never be erased. And as the light of late afternoon filtered through the windows of Bletchley Park, Elizabeth smiled quietly, knowing that at last, the hidden heroes of history were no longer invisible. Their brilliance, courage, and resilience had endured and would continue to inspire the world for generations to come. Elizabeth stood alone in the quiet of Bletchley Park, the corridors now empty, the machines silent, their hum a memory. She let her gaze wander over the rows of desks, the faint scratches of pencils on paper, the notebooks still stacked neatly as they had been decades ago. For years, this place had been a fortress of secrecy, its walls guarding the invisible battles fought by brilliant minds. And yet, the impact of those battles had rippled outward, shaping the course of history in ways the world could scarcely imagine. It was easy to forget, in the modern world, just how extraordinary these women had been. They had worked tirelessly, often in obscurity, with intelligence, courage, and unwavering focus. Every calculation, every deciphered message, every long night spent staring at endless strings of letters had been a tiny act of heroism. They had carried the weight of entire lives on their shoulders, lives they would never meet, for which they would never receive thanks. Yet they persisted, guided not by recognition, but by a sense of duty and an unspoken understanding that their work mattered more than applause. Elizabeth reflected on the lessons embedded in their stories. True courage is often quiet, unnoticed, and uncelebrated. Brilliance does not always shine in public. Sometimes it hums quietly in the background, altering the world without fanfare. And sacrifice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is measured in lost sleep, silent tension, and the hidden labor of minds pushing themselves to their limits. These women had transformed history not with weapons, but with intellect, collaboration, and an extraordinary commitment to a cause greater than themselves. And yet, as Elizabeth looked out across the gardens, she couldn't help but wonder, for every hero whose story has finally been told, how many remain unknown? How many acts of bravery, ingenuity, and quiet perseverance have gone unnoticed, tucked away in the shadows of history? The women of Bletchley Park were only one thread in a vast tapestry of unseen courage. Their story is a reminder that the world is far richer, far more complex, and far more extraordinary than it often appears. Elizabeth smiled softly, a mixture of pride and melancholy washing over her. The recognition that had come decades later could never replace the years of silence, but it mattered nonetheless. It mattered that their intelligence, resilience, and unwavering dedication were finally acknowledged. It mattered that future generations would know that women, often overlooked in their own time, had shaped history in ways both monumental and invisible. The shadows of Bletchley Park held secrets that would never be fully revealed, yet they also held inspiration. Elizabeth understood that heroism does not always seek the spotlight. It resides in the minds and hearts of those who quietly change the world, leaving traces that others may follow. And for those who now walk the halls, read the histories, or watch the stories unfold, the message is clear: brilliance and courage exist in the most unexpected places, often unseen, but never insignificant dot as she stepped out into the fading light of the afternoon. Elizabeth left behind the silence of the past, but carried forward a profound truth. The hidden heroes of history, like the women of Bletchley Park, continue to shape our world, often without recognition, always with impact. And somewhere, in some quiet corner, countless others wait, their courage unrecorded, their brilliance unknown. How many remain hidden in the shadows? How many stories are yet to be told?